Ugo Rondinone, the Swiss artist who lives in New York, has proposed to make a new earthwork. And I think it is the first earthwork of its size that, if it is successfully completed, will have been made in this country in a long time. Probably since the works by Christo, either the Gates project in Central Park or maybe even the Umbrellas project. Ugo wants to construct 7 magic mountains just west of Los Angeles, off Interstate 15, which is the freeway that runs from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. I'm sorry, he wants to do it just west of Las Vegas. And the project would be on the border of Jean Dry Lake, which is a very important site in contemporary art history because that's where Jean Tinguely made one of his end-of-the-world exploding sculptures. And it's where, or installations, and it's where Michael Heiser created the first of the 9 Nevada depressions in the late 1960s, which was an earthwork that had 9 components that covered most of the state of Nevada. It's a very large project. The 7 magic mountains are, well, maybe 20 to 40 feet high each. They're close enough together so that there's a feeling of enclosure, like you're walking through a desert canyon. Each one will be colored a color of the rainbow in kind of a day glow, very, very bright color. So it's an interesting project for several different reasons. One of which is, instead of digging into the earth like many early earthworks projects, this one is actually piling up, so that's interesting. It's a big project that will take a lot of money to make, but nonetheless it will not last for longer than probably 2 years. So it is not meant to be permanent, as are some of the other earlier earthworks projects. It's meant to be a gesture that will be temporary. And it's also very interesting because it injects color into the landscape when most earthworks projects do not. In fact, they determinedly avoid color because they are, well, color is expensive. You have to actually do something to make the color. 2, it is not a very somber, kind of American puritanical land-based palette. And 3, it's simply against the tradition of what Dave Hickey has called brown art, which is what he calls earthworks. So, yeah, so it's going to be a very interesting project, we think. We hope to have it open in October of 2014, but it depends on the permitting process. The studio has not yet finished the final working drawings as of now, which is December 2013. The permitting process will take some months, and then you have to go into construction. The rocks have to be large enough. They have to be big boulders, really, so that people can climb on them and not move them around, so they're safe, they're stable. So that's going to take some time. The permitting process involves surveying where all the desert tortoises or other endangered species might exist on the land. It's land that's been previously disturbed right in between the freeway and Jean Dry Lake, so it's not pristine desert. The Bureau of Land Management, therefore, has no problem, in theory, permitting it to be used for a temporary sculpture. But it has to be, the environmental protection safeguards have to all be considered, and that takes a while. That's the permitting process. We really, there's great interest in this project because Ugo comes from a family of stonecutters. He has a familial relationship with the material itself, and yet he is choosing to extend it into a new realm with color, which is part of what his traditional palette has been in his sculptural works. So we think it'll be a fabulous project, and we really hope that that this occurs sooner rather than later. Yeah, there are 2 organizations that are commissioning this Rondinone project. One is Art Production Fund in New York City, which has been responsible for helping a lot of large projects happen. Olafur Eliasson's Waterfalls in the New York City Harbor, the Bay Lights project by Via Real in San Francisco. So that's one organization, and then the other one is our museum. Well, the amount of traffic on Interstate 15 between Los Angeles and Las Vegas is huge. So that's the primary audience for this project. It's another audience, actually, this project is large enough, is actually the air traffic that goes between the 2 cities. You'll be able to see it from the air. There will be organizations inevitably that will want to organize tours, and we may or may not be engaged in some of that. The project will receive so much attention, so much press, so many images, and be seen by so many people already. It's not as if you have to actually organize much to have it be available to millions of people. There's a long tradition of artists being offered opportunities to spend time in, if not remote locations, at least very quiet places. And the Yaddo, retreat here in the United States is a good example of that. But since the 1960s, increasingly there have been a number of sites that are set up to offer artists opportunities to conduct research and make experiments and create projects on the land. So for example, a very notable one is the Center for Land Use Interpretation's Wendover facility. Wendover is a town on the Nevada-Utah border. It was the largest military base in World War II of any kind anywhere. It's where the Enola Gay was briefly hangared before it flew off to the Pacific and then on to Hiroshima. And the old military base still has a lot of buildings that are standing, and some of those are leased by the Center for Land Use Interpretation. And they have also put a trailer unit there, kind of an office, single-wide mobile trailer. And there's another trailer there that you can sleep in, and so there's this very nice working circumstance that you have right on the edge of the Bonneville Salt Flats in a town that is small, that nonetheless, because it's in Nevada, has big hotels, so it has amenities. So it's relatively comfortable, even though you're on the edge of or within a very harsh environment, and you're in an historically very interesting place. So there's a lot to think about. There's commercial activity in terms of active salt production and chemical extraction from the salt flats. There's a railway line, a fiber optics trunk line, the interstate freeway, air corridors, the old Pioneer Trail, and everything runs through Wendover. So it's a very rich landscape, both in terms geologically, but in terms of also anthropic effect upon the landscape. There are other sites in New Mexico. There are a couple of different sites that have been set up by artists. The Land is one that is south of Albuquerque. That is a couple that also has a gallery in Albuquerque. So you produce something on the land, document it, bring back some kind of traces of that project, or the project itself, depending on what it is, to the gallery. That's a very nice one. There's the U-Cross Foundation in Wyoming. That's a ranch that is still functioning, somewhat as a ranch, but also has these beautiful cabins available. There are many, many residency opportunities in almost probably every state in the United States. And they are increasingly a site where if you are a student or a graduate student and you've come out of school with a hankering to continue land-based practices and research-based projects, these are residencies that are very desirable. It's a way of continuing your career and acting within the semi-academic, quasi-museum or gallery world. There are some other residencies that are even more interesting that are not based really so much on a specific site as on the notion of a journey. The Arctic Circle is a good example of one. It is a sailing ship that goes from northern Norway, from Tromsø, and goes to Spitsbergen into the archipelago, and he visits Svalbard and various Arctic communities. And that is one that everybody from performance and installation people to painters actually take part in. There is the most coveted one of all, the National Science Foundation's Visiting Artists and Writers Antarctic program. The Antarctic is the most difficult place to get to in terms of money and in terms of safety. And I think the entire program that the National Science Foundation has run for since the mid-1970s, when Elliot Porter was the first artist who was sent. I think that entire program has seen still less than 100 artists in the Antarctic, actually on the continent working there. So not a tourist boat, but an actual serious involvement with a science team or wherever. So there's all of these research opportunities really do center around the idea of don't come here with a project in mind that you could do anywhere else. Come here with an idea that you might do something you could only do here, some kind of investigation that you would make that would be relevant to this place. So it would be place specific. It would have a relationship perhaps with land, and then these projects would occur over a space of maybe anywhere from a week to 3 months. The practice that I have developed over 20 years now is really concerned about the interaction of human cognition with land to turn it into landscape, or to turn space into place, or terrain into territory. It depends on the context that I'm writing about. That comes out of my work as a poet, which is very much concerned with trying to uncover that process. And so the books that I've written, I think there are now 15 of them, tend to take place in extreme environments. So I'll actually go to the Antarctic or the Arctic or the Atacama Desert in Chile or wherever it is, and actually look at where human cognition fails to perceive a place accurately. Artists like these places a lot, and so some of these residency programs are deliberately placed, like the Kluwe Center for Land Use Interpretation residency in Wendover is deliberately in a place where not only has there been intense anthropic effect upon the landscape, but it's a very difficult place to perceive. Human cognitive neurophysiology developed on the savanna, and it developed, or in broken woodlands in Africa, and it developed around the world as we expanded through temperate zones. It was very well suited to that. It was suited to scale our limbs to the limbs of the trees, for example. Our visual regime, our perceptual regime for understanding scale and size in landscape is based upon the fact that over distance things turn blue, mountains turn blue the farther they are from us. And that's true in paintings, from about the 1300s or 1400s onwards, as well as in life. So when you go to places where those rules do not obtain very easily, where there's no vegetation to scale yourself against, where things look much the same in all directions, which is to say they are isotropic, and where things do not turn a predictable shift in the spectrum, because you're, let's say, in a desert where things are brown instead of plant-based, so they're not as blue. So things that you think are only 3 miles away are actually more like 13 miles away. Those are great places to go observe how human culture has to make up for what the cognitive neurophysiology cannot accomplish. So if you go to a place that's big and highly isotropic and empty of a lot of mechanisms by which we can scale ourselves, such as the Antarctic or the Arctic, then you find people not just deploying maps, but deploying pictorial conventions to try and organize the space. You find people, for instance, in the Antarctic at the McMurdo station, becoming very fond of the 100 telephone poles there because it's the only standing forest in the Antarctic. So you actually have something to kind of understand the size of the place. So, my practice has therefore coincided to some extent with artist residencies in big deserts, in empty places. And so the art of the extreme is of great interest, not just to me, but of course to the work that the Center for Art and Environment does, because we look for the traces left behind of art, architecture, and narrative, those cultural means that we use to establish place that go beyond when we get lost. There's something deeply romantic about the notion of being a nomad, of going from place to place. Not just a traveler where you go and you experience something and you take notes and you take photographs and you go home and you've had an experience, you've documented it, but of someone who goes to a place that you may return to or you establish a much deeper relationship with. So you're not a tourist, you're not even a traveler, you're a nomad. That is something else. You are dependent on some profound way for your existence upon where you are. And nomad means, of course, that you can return to these places time and time again, or simply, in my terms, that you have a much deeper relationship with that place. And there are many people, many artists who like being outside and who very much like the idea that the world is not going to be mediated for me by a house, by a cabin, by a picture window, which is another kind of frame like a camera frame. Instead, I'm going to have a very direct experience with the world. I'm going to actually be out in the world, which means I'm going to be affected by the elements, for example. So I think there's a high degree of confluence between people who like to camp, people who like to investigate art and environment, and people who desire some kind of this, we talked about this before, this authentic relationship with the world. there's something going on in Europe that I think is very interesting, and that is the commissioning of place-specific sculptures or installations, permanent or temporary, to attract tourism. And there's a wonderful project, a whole series of projects, a large program in Norway that does this. There's projects now going on in Switzerland doing this. It's really using creative capital. That is to use, Florida's idea of creative people and their interactions with place as a way of being an economic component, a social and cultural and economic component of a place. And I'm very interested in this because sometimes the projects, I think, are not successful because they invite people to come in and to make a project, and the project is a very superficial reaction to the place, in part perhaps because they don't have enough time to spend there, or because they're simply not very good artists. It just depends. Sometimes the projects are magnificent, regardless of the fame of the artist or whether or not you know this person. You'll come across a project and you say, that made me see this place in a way that I had not seen it before. And word gets around that it's marvelous, it's a wonderful experience, that you have a way of coming across the world that you can't have any other way. And that will attract people, that will bring people to a place who have not otherwise been there. Cultural tourism is, and has been for 2 decades, I think, the fastest growing category of tourism in the world. So it's not people going to see beautiful nature that's the fastest growing, or an endangered ecology. Those are certainly growing and wonderful parts of tourism. Nor is it people going to go to a very famous restaurant and have a great meal. That's a wonderful part of tourism. But it's actually to learn something about the world, and to learn it through cultural means, to learn it through art and architecture. So I think these projects are absolutely terrific, and I hope we see more of them. And I'm really pleased that this is happening in Northern Europe, and I expect to see it happening in other parts of the world. I know there are large sculpture parks, for instance, that are relatively new in New Zealand, Australia, and so forth. And I'm very curious to see how those develop as well. Will they become tourist attractions? I'm not quite sure that's why they're being done. These projects are a little bit different. These are sort of singular projects meant to pull people into a specific place, but I'm very curious to see how this develops. And I think that this would not have happened. These projects would not happen without the vocabulary that was made available to artists through the work of the early earthworks and land art people.